Prologue. The soft murmur of the crowd buzzed in my ears as I stood by my mother's casket, my hands clutching Lander's small, warm fingers like a lifeline. My heart pounded heavily in my chest, but I kept my face neutral. This was the first time in 5 years that Shiela had returned, and I felt the weight of her presence in the room, even though I hadn't seen her yet. It was as if the air itself shifted when she arrived. I could sense people watching me, whispering. I was the disgrace, the one who had ruined the perfect sister, the one who had shattered her own life for one night of stupidity. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the casket's polished surface. Tired eyes, hollow cheeks, hair neatly tied back, but no amount of grooming could mask the exhaustion. The truth was, I had lost myself long before this moment, when I had let my selfish desires destroy not only my life but Sheila's as well. Lander tugged at my hand, bringing me back to reality. "Mommy, are we leaving soon?" His voice was soft, laced with the innocent impatience only a 4-year-old could possess. I knelt down to his level and brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. "Soon, sweetheart. Just a little longer, okay?" I kissed his forehead and stood up again, scanning the room. That's when I saw her. Shiela. She stood in the doorway, elegant as ever in a black dress, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun. My heart clenched. She had always been the beautiful one, the confident one, the one everyone adored. And I was the one who had stolen her happiness. Her eyes found mine across the room, and for a second, I could see the raw pain and betrayal still flickering in her gaze. My stomach twisted with guilt. "Nina," a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Luis." He appeared beside me, his arm brushing against mine in that cold, indifferent way he always did. I hadn't even noticed him arrive. He never really stayed by my side during moments like this. "She's here," he added unnecessarily. "I know," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. I watched as Shiela slowly approached, each step measured, graceful. She looked older somehow, her eyes harder than I remembered. It had been 5 long years since she had left, and those years hadn't been kind to either of us. "Nina," she finally spoke, her voice ice-cold. "Luis." "Shiela," I replied, forcing the word out. I felt Luis stiffen beside me, though he didn't move. There was a moment of unbearable silence as she stared at me, then at Luis. The pain was palpable. "I didn't expect to see you both here together," Shiela said, her tone sharp, accusing. "Still playing house, I see." The words sliced through me. I wanted to defend myself, explain that nothing about my life with Luis had ever been a house, more like a prison. But the guilt rooted me in place. "Shiela, please," I started, my voice trembling. She cut me off with a bitter laugh. "Please what, Nina? Please understand? Please forgive you?" She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as her voice dropped. "Do you know how long it took for me to get over what you did? You, my own sister, took everything from me." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. Because she was right. I had taken everything from her. Luis, standing between us now, folded his arms, looking everywhere but at us. I could feel the resentment radiating off him. He hadn't wanted to marry me, and he made that clear every single day of the past 5 years. This wasn't the life either of us had imagined. "Shiela," Louis finally spoke, his voice gruff. "This isn't the time." She laughed bitterly again, her gaze flicking between the two of us. "Isn't it, Luis? When will be the time then? Should I wait another 5 years to talk about how you both betrayed me?" Her voice cracked, and for a brief moment, the anger faded, leaving only the hurt behind. I swallowed hard. "I never wanted this," I whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you, Shiela." Sheila's eyes blazed with fury as she stepped closer. "But you did, Nina. You hurt me in the worst possible way. You knew I loved him," she pointed at Luis. "And yet you still took him. You couldn't stand to see me happy." "That's not true," I said, my voice rising, desperation leaking into my words. "I made a mistake, Shiela. I was stupid. I was drunk." "Drunk?" Shiela echoed, disbelief washing over her face. "You seduced him, Nina. You seduced the man I was going to marry." The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around my neck. I had no defense. What I had done was unforgivable, and even now, 5 years later, I couldn't take it back. Luis stood silently between us, his expression unreadable. He had always been this way, detached, cold. The man I had once loved was long gone, replaced by someone who resented me just as much as I resented myself. "I regret it every single day," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper. Sheila's gaze softened for the briefest moment, but then it hardened again. Regret doesn't erase what you did. Luis shifted uncomfortably, looking at Shiela. Shiela, we don't need to do this now. This is a funeral, not a reunion of the past. Shiela stared at him, her eyes filling with unshed tears. Do you even care, Luis? About any of it? He looked at her then, really looked at her. It's been 5 years, Shiela. A lot has happened since then. She shook her head in disbelief, her voice breaking. I came back because I thought maybe we could try again. But seeing you two standing there together, her voice trailed off and she took a step back. I was a fool to think anything had changed. She turned to leave, her back rigid, her steps quick. Shiela, wait. I called after her, but she didn't stop. My voice broke, the weight of everything crashing down on me again. As she disappeared through the doorway, Luis sighed heavily beside me. She'll never forgive you, Nina. She'll never forgive us. I looked up at him, the man who had once been everything to me. Do you? He didn't answer. He just walked away, leaving me standing alone beside our mother's casket, my son clinging to my hand. Chapter 1. The silence in the house was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face, once full of life and hope, was now a mask of exhaustion. Dark circles ringed my eyes, and my once bright smile had long faded into a permanent frown. I glanced at the clock again. It was past midnight, and Luis still wasn't home. He rarely came home on time anymore, not that it mattered. When he did, it was usually in a drunken stupor, muttering something about how he should have been with Shiela, how I had ruined his life, how I had trapped him. I had heard it all before, each word like a knife to my already fragile heart. The front door creaked open, and I stiffened, bracing myself for whatever version of Luis would walk in tonight. Would it be the cold, distant man who ignored me completely? Or the angry, resentful one who took every opportunity to remind me of my mistakes? I heard his footsteps echo through the hallway, unsteady and heavy. Drunk again. Nina. His voice slurred as he stumbled into the bedroom, the smell of alcohol hitting me like a wave. Why are you still up? I was waiting for you, I replied quietly, my eyes lowered. Why bother? He scoffed, swaying slightly as he leaned against the doorframe. I don't need you to wait for me. I didn't respond. I had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. Instead, I stood up and walked towards him, trying to steady him as he stumbled forward. Don't touch me, he snapped, pulling his arm away from me. I don't need your help, Nina. I stepped back, my hands falling to my sides. This was our life now, constant tension, anger, and resentment. The love we once shared, if it had ever existed, was long gone. Luis collapsed onto the bed, his arm flung over his eyes. You've ruined everything, he muttered, the familiar bitterness lacing his words. I should have been with Shiela. I swallowed the lump in my throat, the familiar sting of tears pressing at the back of my eyes. I know, I whispered. I know you loved her. His hand fell to his side, and he turned his head to look at me, his eyes glassy. Loved her? He laughed, a cold, cruel sound. I still do. You think I'll ever stop loving her? You think I wanted this? His voice grew louder, more vicious. You trapped me, Nina, you and your selfishness. The words hit me like a slap. I had heard them before, but they never lost their sting. I could never deny what I had done. That night, the drunken seduction, the betrayal, I had destroyed my sister's life, and in doing so, I had destroyed my own. I'm sorry, I said, my voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Luis. He laughed again, sitting up on the bed, his eyes narrowing at me. Sorry? Sorry doesn't fix anything, Nina. Sorry doesn't give me back the life I could have had. He stood up, swaying slightly, his breath hot against my face as he leaned in closer. Do you think I want to be here? With you? I'm only here because of him. His gaze flicked towards the door, towards Lander's room. My heart clenched at the mention of our son. Lander was the only good thing that had come from this mess, the one person who made me feel like my life wasn't a complete disaster. Lander deserves a family, I whispered, my voice shaking. He deserves to have both his parents. Luis sneered. A family? This isn't a family, Nina. This is a prison. He turned away from me, grabbing his jacket from the chair. I'm going out, he said, his tone cold and final. Luis, please. I started, but he was already halfway out the door. Don't wait up for me, he called over his shoulder before slamming the door behind him. I stood frozen in place, the sound of the door echoing in my ears. The emptiness in the room seemed to swallow me whole, and for a moment, I let myself feel the weight of it all, the guilt, the regret, the hopelessness. But then, a small voice broke through the silence. "Mommy?" I turned to see Lander standing in the doorway of his room, his sleepy eyes blinking up at me. He was clutching his stuffed bear, the one I had given him on his first birthday. "Mommy, where's Daddy going?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. I forced a smile, kneeling down to his level. "Daddy's just going out for a little while. Sweetheart, he'll be back soon." Lander nodded, though his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why does Daddy always leave?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. How could I explain to a 4-year-old the complicated mess of emotions and resentment that defined our marriage? How could I tell him that his father didn't love me, that he barely tolerated me? "Sometimes grown-ups need time to think," I said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Lander's forehead. Lander looked at me with his big, innocent eyes, and for a moment, I felt like the worst mother in the world. Luis may have had his faults, but he loved Lander in his own way. He showered him with expensive toys, fancy dinners, and trips to amusement parks, things I could never afford to give him. And yet, I knew deep down that all I could offer was my love and the comfort of knowing I would always be there for him. "I love you, Lander," I whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "I love you too, Mommy," he murmured against my shoulder, his little arms wrapping around my neck. As I held him close, I felt a surge of determination rise within me. Lander was my everything, the reason I got up each morning, the reason I endured the pain and the shame. I couldn't change the past, I couldn't take back what I had done to Shiela or to Luis or to myself, but I could give my son a better future. One day I would find a way to break free from this suffocating life for both of us. But for now, I would endure. For Lander. Chapter 2. The air felt heavy, as if the world itself was closing in around me. I stood by the window, watching the leaves flutter outside in the late afternoon breeze, trying to prepare myself for what was about to happen. Shiela was back. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of guilt, dread, and fear swirling inside me. Shiela, the golden child. The one who had always been perfect, who had once had Luis's heart in her hands. And then, I ruined everything. She had every right to hate me, and I deserved whatever was coming. There was a knock on the door. My breath caught in my throat. I knew it was her. Luis had told me she wanted to talk, no, confront me. I opened the door, and there she stood, as beautiful and poised as ever, her eyes cold and piercing. Behind her stood my mother and Luis's parents, arms crossed, their faces a mask of contempt. "Nina," Shiela said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "We need to talk." I stepped aside to let her in, my hands trembling. Shiela swept past me like a storm, her presence commanding the room. My mother and Luis's parents followed behind her, standing in a semicircle, as if preparing to witness a battle. I tried to brace myself for the inevitable blow, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "I'm back," Shiela announced, her voice calm but sharp, like a knife sliding through my chest, "and I'm here to reclaim what's mine." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," she replied, her eyes narrowing as they bored into me. "Luis, he was mine, Nina, and he should have stayed mine." The room felt like it was spinning. My hands clutched the sides of my dress, my nails digging into the fabric as I fought to stay upright. You came back for Luis?" My voice came out in a whisper, barely audible. Shiela smiled coldly, a bitter smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes. I've spent the last 5 years trying to forget, but I can't. And now that I'm here, I'm gonna get him back." My heart plummeted into my stomach. Luis. She was here to take him away, and deep down, I knew she could. He never loved me. He only stayed because of Lander, because I had trapped him in a life he never wanted. I had no right to stand in her way. My mother, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "It's for the best, Nina. You were never meant to be with Luis. You've caused enough damage already. It's time to fix this mess." Fix the mess. That's what I was, an inconvenience, a stain on their perfect lives. I glanced at Luis's parents, who nodded in agreement, their faces cold and unforgiving. Luis had never hidden his resentment, never hesitated to remind me how much he still loved Shiela. And now she was offering him a way out. They were all offering him a way out. Are you going to fight me on this, Nina? Sheila's voice was a challenge, daring me to stand in her way. I wanted to scream, to tell her how much I had suffered these past years, how much I regretted everything, but I couldn't. The guilt weighed me down like a stone, suffocating me. This was my punishment for betraying her. My voice cracked. I won't fight you. Sheila raised an eyebrow, surprised by my response. You won't? I shook my head, tears brimming in my eyes. No, Sheila, I've hurt you enough. If you and Luis want to be together, I won't stand in your way. For a moment, the room was silent, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my next move. My mother's expression softened slightly, but only for a brief second. You're making the right choice, Nina, she said, her voice colder than I had expected. It's time for you to let go. Let go. The words echoed in my mind. I had never really had Luis, but I had held on to the hope that maybe someday things could get better. But now there was nothing left. Nothing but Lander. I'll file for divorce, I said quietly, my voice trembling. I'll make it easy for you. The words felt like knives slicing through my chest, but I forced them out. Sheila deserved to be happy, and Luis, he deserved to be with the one he truly loved. Sheila didn't say anything. She just stared at me, as if sizing me up, trying to figure out if I was really serious. But then, with a curt nod, she turned to leave. My mother and Luis's parents followed her, their silence louder than any words they could have spoken. As the door clicked shut behind them, I collapsed onto the couch, the tears I had been holding back spilling over. My heart ached with the weight of everything I had just agreed to. I knew this was the right thing to do, for Luis, for Sheila, for everyone. But the pain was unbearable. I didn't know how long I sat there, my sobs the only sound in the empty house, but eventually I felt a small hand tug at my sleeve. Mommy? I wiped my tears hastily and looked down to see Lander standing beside me, his big, innocent eyes filled with concern. He must have heard everything. My heart broke all over again as I pulled him into my arms. Lander, baby, it's okay, I whispered, stroking his hair. Mommy's just a little sad. Are you sad because Auntie Sheila is back? Lander asked, his voice soft and full of childlike confusion. I didn't know how to explain it to him, how to tell him that his father would soon be living with someone else, someone who wasn't me. Mommy and Daddy are going to live in different houses, I said gently, trying to keep my voice steady. But we both love you so much, Lander, that will never change. Lander looked up at me, his eyes wide. Does that mean Daddy won't visit me anymore? The question felt like a punch to the gut. Luis might have treated me like nothing, but he adored Lander. I knew he wouldn't abandon his son. No, sweetheart, I reassured him. Daddy will visit you all the time. You'll still see him, I promise. Lander nodded, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. He was too young to understand the complexities of the situation, but he knew enough to realize that something was wrong. Can Daddy still take me to the park? Lander asked, his voice trembling slightly. Of course, I said, forcing a smile. You can still go to the park with Daddy, and you can still spend time with him whenever you want. Lander hesitated for a moment, then wrapped his arms around my neck, holding me tightly. I love you, Mommy. Tears welled up in my eyes again, but this time they were different. This was love, the pure, unconditional love that only my son could give me. I love you too, Lander, I whispered, holding him close, more than anything in the world. As I sat there, cradling my son, I made a silent vow to myself. No matter what happened, no matter how much pain I had to endure, I would give Lander the best life I could. I had made my decision. I would let Luis go, but I wouldn't lose my son. Chapter 3. The courthouse was colder than I expected. The quiet hum of legal proceedings and the faint rustling of papers made the reality of my situation all the more palpable. This was it, the end of my marriage to Luis. A part of me still couldn't believe it was happening, but I felt numb. After all the years of bitterness and blame, I had nothing left to give. I glanced over at Luis, seated a few feet away from me. He looked relaxed, almost relieved. His eyes never once met mine during the proceedings. He didn't need to. He had won. Sheila was back, and he was free from the marriage that had bound him to me for years. I had always known where his heart truly lay, and now I was giving him back to her. Are both parties in agreement to proceed with the divorce under the mutually agreed terms? the judge asked, his voice echoing in the sterile room. Yes, Your Honor, Luis answered immediately, his tone devoid of any hesitation. I nodded silently, unable to speak. My throat was too tight, the lump lodged there, refusing to go away. I didn't want to cry, not here. Not in front of him, not in front of Sheila's shadow that loomed over everything. The judge stamped the papers, and just like that, it was over. Thank you, I whispered under my breath, not to Luis, but to myself. A quiet acknowledgement that I was free from the lies, from the resentment, from the weight of a marriage that had suffocated me for so long. Luis stood up and walked past me without a word, leaving the room as if nothing significant had just transpired. I sat still for a moment longer, gathering the strength to face the world outside these four walls. The new apartment wasn't much, a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't what I was used to, but it was mine, and more importantly, it was close to Lander's school, allowing me to keep some semblance of stability in his life. He had already been through enough upheaval. As I unpacked the last of the boxes, Lander bounded into the room, his face bright with excitement. Mommy, look, I made a drawing of our new home, he said, thrusting a crayon-colored picture into my hands. I looked at the vibrant lines, our small apartment sketched out in the unsteady hands of a 4-year-old, with me, him, and even our cat, Whiskers, standing outside. It's beautiful, baby, I said, crouching down to hug him. This is our new beginning. Lander grinned, but then his expression shifted to one of concern. Will Daddy come here too? The question was innocent, but it still stung. I ruffled his hair gently. No, sweetie. Daddy has his own place now. But you'll still see him, remember? He'll come and take you out, just like before. Lander nodded, but I could tell he didn't quite understand. How could he? I barely understood it myself. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the street outside, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The weight that had been on my shoulders for years had lifted. I wasn't in a loveless marriage anymore. I wasn't walking on eggshells, afraid of saying the wrong thing to Luis. I was free. The first time I saw Luis and Shiela together, it felt like a punch to the gut. They were at a cafe, sitting at one of the outdoor tables, laughing like they had no care in the world. Shiela was glowing, radiant as ever, while Luis sat close to her, his hand resting possessively on her arm. The sight made me freeze in my tracks. The worst part wasn't that they were together, it was the way they flaunted it. Publicly. Brazenly. As if the last 5 years, my marriage, my pain, meant absolutely nothing. I turned to walk away, but before I could leave unnoticed, Sheila's voice rang out. Nina. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly I turned to face her. Luis looked mildly uncomfortable, but Shiela had that triumphant glint in her eye, as if she had finally won a game we were never meant to play. I see you're adjusting to your new life, she said, her voice sweet but sharp. How's the apartment? I forced a smile. It's good. Lander likes it. That's good to hear, she replied, though I could tell she wasn't interested in Lander or anything about my life. She just wanted to rub salt into the wound. Luis and I were just talking about how happy we are now. It's like we finally get to pick up where we left off. I swallowed the lump in my throat and kept my voice steady. I'm glad you're both happy. Luis shifted in his seat, looking anywhere but at me. We should get going, he muttered under his breath, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. But Shiela wasn't done. You know, Nina, it's funny how things turn out, isn't it? Sometimes life just has a way of fixing itself. Fixing itself. As if I was the mistake, the broken piece of the puzzle that needed to be removed for everything to be perfect again. I nodded tightly, not trusting myself to say anything more. Without another word, I turned and walked away, my heart heavy. But as I put more distance between us, the sting of their cruelty began to fade. They could flaunt their happiness all they wanted, but I no longer had to carry the burden of Luis's resentment. I was free, and that was more than enough. Back at the apartment, I sat with Lander as he played with his toys on the living room floor. I watched him, his innocent joy the only bright spot in a world that still felt too dark at times. Mommy? Lander looked up at me, his wide eyes searching mine. Are you happy? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about happiness in a long time. Not in the real sense, anyway. But as I looked at my son, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was starting to feel something close to it. "I'm getting there, baby," I said, leaning down to kiss the top of his head. "I'm getting there." And in that moment, I knew it was true. This new life, this quieter, smaller life, wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I was beginning to feel like I could start over. I could rebuild. Away from the shadows of my past, away from Luis and Shiela and their perfect little world. Lander was my world now. And for him, I would find a way to be happy again. Chapter 4. The smell of bleach and cleaning solution clung to my clothes as I scrubbed the pristine floors of the Simons mansion. My knees ached from hours of work and my hands were raw from constant scrubbing, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me that I was earning my way, no longer dependent on Luis, no longer shackled to the life I once had. This job wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. Each time I wiped down a marble countertop or dusted an ornate chandelier, I reminded myself that this was a step forward. My hands may have been rough now, but I was slowly rebuilding, brick by brick, after the collapse of my marriage and the illusion of my former life. The laughter of the Simons children echoed down the hallway as I worked. They were carefree, running about in their expensive clothes, oblivious to the struggles of people like me. For a moment, my heart ached for Lander. I wondered if he missed that world, the world of luxury I'd once been part of but was now on the outside looking in. "Mommy!" Lander's voice would light up my world whenever I picked him up after school, his small arms wrapping around my waist, his laughter filling the empty spaces in my heart. No matter how tired I was, how bruised my soul felt, Lander made everything worth it. I shook myself from the thought and focused back on the task at hand. It wasn't time to wallow. It was time to keep going. The Simons family had been kind to me, but kindness didn't erase the sharp edges of the world I now lived in. I wasn't blind to the pity in their eyes when they spoke to me, as if my circumstances were a tragedy they could only witness from afar. They didn't ask about my past, didn't pry into my life as a divorcee or my complicated relationship with Luis. I appreciated that silence. However, not everyone was so tactful. Luis's mocking voice echoed in my head as I recalled the last time I ran into him at the grocery store. He was standing there, dressed in designer clothes, his cart overflowing with expensive items. Meanwhile, I was counting my pesos, sticking to the essentials: rice, vegetables, and a few snacks for Lander. "Really, Nina?" Luis had sneered as he caught sight of me. "Cleaning houses now? I guess you really did end up where you belong." I ignored him at first, focusing on placing the last item in my cart, but he wasn't done. "It's just funny how things turned out, isn't it? You left me with no choice but to move on. But hey, at least Sheila's not cleaning floors for a living." His words cut deep, reopening wounds I thought had started to heal. I wanted to fire back, tell him that I was working hard for our son, that I was doing what I needed to survive. But I knew better than to engage in a battle with Luis. He thrived on making me feel small. Instead, I smiled and replied, "At least I can look at myself in the mirror and be proud of the work I do, Luis. Can you say the same?" His smug grin faltered for a second before he rolled his eyes and walked away, muttering something under his breath. I didn't care to hear it. I refused to let him ruin the little piece I was trying to build. That night, after putting Lander to bed, I collapsed on the couch, feeling every muscle in my body ache from the day's work. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I could keep this up, working as a cleaner, living paycheck to paycheck, constantly reminded of the life I had left behind. It was exhausting, but giving up wasn't an option. I had Lander to think about, and his future was worth more than my pride. Luis might have the money, the flashy cars, and the lifestyle I used to know, but I had something far more valuable. I had Lander's love, and no amount of wealth could ever buy that. Still, it wasn't easy watching Luis shower Lander with gifts. Every time Lander came home from a weekend with his father, his arms were full of new toys, new clothes, new gadgets. I could see the excitement in his eyes, the way he marveled at the things his father gave him. A part of me feared that one day, Luis would win. That one day, Lander would choose the father who could give him everything, instead of the mother who could only give him love. But I refused to let that fear consume me. I had to trust that Lander would see the truth in time, that love was more important than material things. A week later, I was folding laundry when I heard the door creak open. Lander came running in, his face alight with joy. "Mommy, look what Daddy got me." He held up a brand new tablet, the kind I could never afford. My heart sank, but I forced a smile. "That's great, sweetheart," I said, trying not to let the hurt show in my voice. "Did you say thank you to Daddy?" Lander nodded, but his excitement faltered as he noticed the look on my face. "Mommy, why don't you get me things like this?" The question hit me like a blow to the chest. I struggled to find the right words, my mind racing. I knelt down in front of him, taking his small hands in mine. "Lander, I know Daddy can buy you lots of things, and I'm so happy you like them. But what I give you, it's different. I give you my time, my love. I make sure you're safe and happy every day." Lander tilted his head, confused. "But Daddy loves me too, right?" I smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Of course he does, and that's what matters. But love, it's not about how many gifts someone can give you. It's about being there for you, always." He seemed to think about this for a moment before his little arms wrapped around my neck. "I love you, Mommy." Tears pricked my eyes as I held him close. "I love you too, baby. Always." Weeks passed, and I continued my work at the Simons' house, each day blending into the next. My life wasn't glamorous, and my hands bore the marks of hard labor. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I was building something on my own terms. And every night, when Lander wrapped his arms around me before bed and whispered, "Good night, Mommy," I knew I was doing the right thing. No matter how many toys or gadgets Luis bought, Lander's love for me was pure, untainted by material things. I might not be able to give him everything, but I was giving him what mattered most: my heart. And that, I reminded myself, was something no amount of money could buy. Chapter 5. The warm sunlight streamed through the large windows of the Simons' living room as I dusted off the family's expensive vases, careful not to leave a single fingerprint. Today was just like any other. Cleaning, working, pushing through the aches in my body, but I had come to accept it as part of my new life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Stability was something I had craved for so long. As I moved to the kitchen, humming softly to myself, I heard a voice behind me, one I hadn't expected. "Nina? Is that really you?" I froze for a second, my heart skipping a beat at the familiarity in that voice. Slowly I turned around and found myself staring into the wide, surprised eyes of Martin Simons. The same Martin Simons I went to high school with, the one who always had a smile on his face and a mischievous glint in his eye. But now, he looked different, older, more polished, and a bit more serious. I blinked, struggling to find my voice. "Martin?" His mouth fell open in shock as he took in my appearance, my cleaning uniform, the rag in my hand, the exhaustion etched into my face. I quickly set down the rag, my cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Wow, I didn't expect to see you here," he said, stepping closer, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. What are you doing here?" I felt a lump form in my throat. Of all the people from my past to run into, Martin was the last person I expected. Memories of high school flooded my mind, memories of the carefree girl I used to be, the one who had dreams and plans, the one who never imagined her life would turn out like this. "I work here," I replied, forcing a small smile. "I'm a cleaner for your family." His eyes widened even more, and I could see the shock ripple through him. "A cleaner? But I thought—" He stopped himself, his brow furrowed. "I thought you were studying to be a teacher." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I was, but things didn't exactly go the way I planned. Martin stared at me, his gaze searching my face for answers, but I couldn't bring myself to explain it all. Not now, not here. I could feel the shame creeping up my spine, the weight of every bad decision I'd made crashing down on me again. Luis, Shiela, the scandal, my failed marriage. It all felt like an open wound I didn't want to expose in front of Martin. Before I could say more, Mrs. Simons entered the room, her eyes lighting up when she saw Martin. "Oh, Martin, I see you've met Nina." Martin nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on me. "Yeah, we went to high school together." Mrs. Simons smiled warmly. "Nina's been working with us for a while now. She's a wonderful help, and her little boy, Lander, is just adorable." I gave a tight smile, grateful for her kind words, but feeling even more exposed under Martin's scrutiny. "Well," Mrs. Simons continued, I'll leave you two to catch up. Martin, let me know if you need anything. As she walked away, Martin turned back to me, his expression softer now. Nina, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's been a long time. I nodded, my eyes drifting to the floor. Yeah, it has. There was an awkward silence between us, and I wondered if he was judging me, if he saw me as nothing more than a woman who had fallen from grace, stuck cleaning houses to survive. But then, he surprised me. I'm sorry for asking like that. I didn't mean to pry, Martin said gently. But if you ever want to talk, I'm here. It seems like you've been through a lot. I glanced up at him, feeling a surge of gratitude for his kindness. Thank you, Martin. I appreciate that. Days passed, and I tried to push the encounter with Martin to the back of my mind. I wasn't ready to dive into the messy details of my life, especially not with someone from my past. But Martin kept coming back, visiting his family more often than I expected, always offering a warm smile when we crossed paths. One afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen, Mrs. Simons approached me with a serious look on her face. Nina, can we talk for a moment? I wiped my hands on my apron, a sudden wave of anxiety washing over me. Had I done something wrong? She sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for me to sit with her. I've been thinking about your situation. Martin mentioned you two went to school together, and it got me thinking. You've always been such a hard worker, and I know life hasn't been easy for you. But, Nina, you deserve more. I blinked, unsure where this conversation was going. Mrs. Simons, I want to help you, she interrupted softly, her eyes filled with sincerity. You're smart, Nina. You had dreams of becoming a teacher, didn't you? I felt my throat tighten. Yes, but that was a long time ago. Things are different now. They don't have to be, she said firmly. There are online programs where you can finish your degree, and I'm willing to help with the cost if that's what's holding you back. I've seen how much you care about Lander, how hard you work to provide for him. You deserve a chance to build a future for both of you. Tears welled up in my eyes. I hadn't expected this, hadn't expected anyone to believe in me after everything I'd been through. For so long, I had felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my mistakes, like I was destined to live in the shadows of my past. But here was Mrs. Simons, offering me a lifeline. I don't know what to say, I whispered, my voice trembling. Thank you. I never thought anyone would give me another chance. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You're stronger than you think, Nina, and it's never too late to start over. That night, after putting Lander to bed, I sat at the kitchen table in my small apartment, staring at the laptop Mrs. Simons had given me. My heart raced as I scrolled through the online course options, a mixture of excitement and fear bubbling inside me. Could I really do this? Could I balance work, motherhood, and school? It felt impossible, but the more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I had to try. Not just for myself, but for Lander. He deserved a mother who fought for their future, who didn't give up. As I clicked the enroll button on the course registration page, a surge of hope filled my chest. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward, like there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally getting my second chance. Chapter 6. The news spread like wildfire, igniting whispers in every corner of town. Luis, the man who had once been at the center of a scandal between Shiela and me, was caught in yet another betrayal, this time against Shiela herself. The irony stung, like a bitter pill that was hard to swallow even for me. I found out about it while picking Lander up from school. The other moms were huddled in a group, speaking in low, scandalized voices as they glanced at me with those all-too-familiar pitying stares. Did you hear? Luis was caught with another woman, one of them whispered. Poor Shiela, she left everything behind for him, and now he's done the same thing to her, another added, shaking her head. I didn't stop to listen to more. I couldn't. My chest tightened, and my hands trembled as I gripped Lander's backpack, trying to focus on getting him home without letting my emotions spill over. But inside, a storm raged. How could Luis do this? How could he hurt Shiela the way he had hurt me? I had spent years carrying the guilt of that night, the shame of tearing my sister's life apart, but now it was clear that Luis had never really changed. He hadn't betrayed just me, he was incapable of being loyal to anyone. That evening, After I had tucked Lander into bed, I sat alone in the living room, trying to process everything. The past few years had been an endless cycle of regret, anger, and heartache, but now, with this revelation, something inside me shifted. I knew I should feel some kind of vindication, some small satisfaction that Shiela was finally seeing the truth about Luis. But instead, all I felt was sadness. For her, for myself, for the way we had both let this man ruin our lives. I had lost my sister, and now she had lost him too. The doorbell rang, startling me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. My heart raced as I opened the door, and there she stood, Shiela. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying, and the moment she saw me, her expression crumbled. "Nina?" She choked out, her voice trembling. I didn't know where else to go. For a moment, I stood there, frozen. Shiela, who had been so distant and cold ever since the scandal, was now standing at my door, vulnerable and broken. Without thinking, I stepped aside, letting her in. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. I closed the door and stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to reach out and hold her, but another part of me, the part that had been hurt and betrayed, held back. After a few moments, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with raw pain. "He did it again, Nina. He cheated on me, just like he did with you." I swallowed hard, the memories of that night rushing back. I had spent years wishing I could take it all back, wishing I had never let my emotions get the best of me. And now, here we were, standing on the other side of the same betrayal. "I'm sorry, Shiela," I whispered, unsure of what else to say. She shook her head, her voice bitter and shaky. "You were right. I never should have gone back to him. I thought if I could just fix things, if I could just reclaim what was mine, I'd be happy again. But I was wrong." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time I saw my sister not as the woman I had hurt, but as someone just as lost as I had been. She had been chasing a ghost, an illusion of the life she thought she should have had with Luis. But it was all a lie. I sat down across from her, choosing my words carefully. "Shiela, Luis was never worth it, not then and not now." She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, but there was something else there too, understanding. For the first time in years, we were finally on the same page, seeing the truth of what Luis had done to both of us. "I thought he loved me," she murmured, her voice cracking. "I thought I was the one who got away, the one he regretted losing. But I was just convenient for him." I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. "He's never loved anyone the way he should. Not me, not you, Luis. He only cares about himself." Shiela let out a bitter laugh. "And I thought I was special." She wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. "You know, I spent all these years hating you for what happened. I thought it was all your fault. But now, I realize I should have hated him." I felt a lump rise in my throat. I had been waiting for this moment for so long, waiting for Shiela to understand, to forgive me. But now that it was here, I wasn't sure how to feel. "I'm so sorry, Shiela," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could take it all back. I wish things had been different." Shiela shook her head, giving me a sad smile. "I know you're sorry, and I'm sorry too, for everything. I should have seen who he really was." For the first time in years, the tension between us seemed to ease. We weren't sisters torn apart by a scandal anymore. We were two women who had both been hurt by the same man. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could start to heal. In the following days, the scandal surrounding Luis exploded. Everyone in town was talking about it, just as they had years ago when our own scandal had made headlines. This time, though, I wasn't the one at the center of it. It was Luis. His infidelity, his lies. And for the first time, people were starting to see him for who he really was. Shiela, meanwhile, disappeared from the public eye, refusing to entertain any of the gossip. She stayed with me for a few days, finding solace in the quiet of my small apartment. We talked, not about Luis, but about everything else. About Lander, about our parents, about the things we had missed out on while we were estranged. It wasn't easy, and there were still wounds that needed time to heal. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had my sister back. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, sipping tea, Shiela broke the silence. "I'm leaving town." I looked at her, surprised but understanding. "Where will you go?" I don't know yet, she said with a sigh. But I need to start over. I can't keep living in the past, chasing a life that's never going to happen. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. I think that's the right decision. Shiela smiled softly. I don't want to lose you again, Nina. No matter where I go, I want us to stay in touch. Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. We will. And in that moment, as I hugged my sister goodbye, I knew that this was the beginning of something new. Not just for her, but for both of us. We had both been broken by the same man, but we were finally free. Chapter 7. Life had taken on a new rhythm. Between my work as a cleaner for the Simons family, my online classes, and caring for Lander, my days were a blur of constant movement. But even in the chaos, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but for the first time, I was living life on my own terms. And then, there was Martin. It started out innocently enough. After our unexpected reunion, Martin had become a steady presence in my life. At first, I couldn't believe it. This man, successful and kind, seemed genuinely interested in me. We would chat briefly when I finished cleaning the Simons estate, and over time, those conversations grew longer. He'd ask me about my classes, encourage me when I felt overwhelmed, and even help me with some of the more difficult subjects when I doubted myself. One day, as I wiped down the kitchen counters at the Simons house, Martin walked in with his usual warm smile. Nina, you're really going to wear yourself out if you keep going at this pace, he teased lightly, pulling up a chair across from where I was working. His tone was playful, but his eyes were full of concern. I smiled back, trying to keep my voice light. I don't really have a choice, Martin. Work, school, and Lander, it's a lot, but it has to be done. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. I don't know how you do it all. You're incredible. I paused, caught off guard by the compliment. I'm just surviving, I said softly. I don't feel incredible most days. Martin shook his head, his gaze steady. Surviving is no small feat, Nina. What you're doing, it's more than most people could handle. You've rebuilt your life after everything that happened with Luis, and now you're even going back to school. That takes strength. I felt my cheeks flush under his kind words. It had been so long since someone had seen me as more than just a woman who had failed in her marriage, more than the scandal or the whispers behind my back. Martin saw me, really saw me. You've been a big help, I admitted, trying to suppress the warmth spreading in my chest. I don't know if I could have made it this far without your support. A flicker of something passed across his face, something deeper than friendship. I looked away, unsure of what to do with the feelings that had been stirring inside me for weeks now. Feelings I had tried to ignore but couldn't. We continued to talk that afternoon, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something had shifted between us. It was subtle, a lingering glance, the way his hand brushed mine as I reached for the dish towel. I couldn't deny it anymore. Martin was becoming more than just a friend. Days turned into weeks, and our connection deepened. He invited Lander and me out on small trips, an afternoon at the park, lunch after school, or just walks in the neighborhood. Lander adored him, and Martin had a way of making him laugh, the kind of belly laughs I hadn't heard from my son in a long time. One evening, after one of our impromptu outings, Martin walked us back to our apartment. As we reached the door, Lander ran inside to get his toys, leaving me and Martin standing in the warm glow of the streetlight. Thanks for today, I said, my voice quiet. Lander had a great time. I did too. He smiled, his eyes soft as they met mine. It's my pleasure. I enjoy spending time with both of you. There was a pause, a moment suspended in the air between us. I could feel the pull, the way his presence made the world feel lighter, safer. But I hesitated. After everything with Luis, I didn't know if I was ready for this, if I could trust myself again, let alone trust someone else. But Martin, ever patient, seemed to sense my hesitation. I know you've been through a lot, Nina, he said, his voice gentle, and I don't want to push you. But I care about you. I care about Lander, and I just want you to know that I'm here, for both of you. His words hit me like a wave, and I blinked back tears. It had been so long since someone had cared about me in that way, with no expectations, no conditions, just genuine care. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. I don't know if I'm ready, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Martin nodded, his expression understanding. That's okay. I'm not going anywhere. We can take things as slow as you need. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to smile, a real, unguarded smile. Thank you, Martin. He smiled back, and for a moment it felt like everything might be okay. Meanwhile, Luis's life was spiraling out of control. His reputation, once shiny and admired, had crumbled under the weight of his infidelity and reckless behavior. Word had spread quickly about how he had cheated on Shiela, and it didn't take long for the town to turn its back on him. He had lost the respect of his family, and even the business he once prided himself on was suffering. But none of that stopped him from trying to win Lander over. Every few weeks he would show up with some extravagant gift, a new video game, the latest phone, expensive sneakers, always trying to buy Lander's affection. One evening, after one of our impromptu outings, Martin walked us back to our apartment. As we reached the door, Lander ran inside to get his toys, leaving me and Martin standing in the warm glow of the streetlight. Thanks for today, I said, my voice quiet. Lander had a great time. I did too. He smiled, his eyes soft as they met mine. It's my pleasure. I enjoy spending time with both of you. There was a pause, a moment suspended in the air between us. I could feel the pull, the way his presence made the world feel lighter, safer. But I hesitated. After everything with Luis, I didn't know if I was ready for this, if I could trust myself again, let alone trust someone else. But Martin, ever patient, seemed to sense my hesitation. I know you've been through a lot, Nina, he said, his voice gentle, and I don't want to push you. But I care about you. I care about Lander, and I just want you to know that I'm here, for both of you. His words hit me like a wave, and I blinked back tears. It had been so long since someone had cared about me in that way, with no expectations, no conditions, just genuine care. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. I don't know if I'm ready, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Martin nodded, his expression understanding. That's okay. I'm not going anywhere. We can take things as slow as you need. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to smile, a real, unguarded smile. Thank you, Martin. He smiled back, and for a moment it felt like everything might be okay. Meanwhile, Luis's life was spiraling out of control. His reputation, once shiny and admired, had crumbled under the weight of his infidelity and reckless behavior. Word had spread quickly about how he had cheated on Shiela, and it didn't take long for the town to turn its back on him. He had lost the respect of his family, and even the business he once prided himself on was suffering. But none of that stopped him from trying to win Lander over. Every few weeks he would show up with some extravagant gift, a new video game, the latest phone, expensive sneakers, always trying to buy Lander's affection. Chapter 8. I never thought I'd make it this far. Standing in front of my computer screen, I watched as the final result of my online course loaded. It had been a grueling few years, working for the Simons family, taking care of Lander, and studying in the late hours after he'd gone to sleep. But now, the final grade flashed on the screen, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Pride. I had done it. I closed the laptop, my heart swelling as the reality of it hit me. I wasn't the same woman who had been tossed aside and belittled, who had been shamed and mocked. I was stronger now, more sure of myself. With my diploma, I had a path to a future I had never dared to imagine before, a future where I could finally stand on my own 2 feet. Nina? Everything okay? Martin's voice pulled me from my thoughts. He had just come over after work, holding a bag of groceries, but he had stopped in the doorway, noticing the expression on my face. I turned to him, unable to hold back the smile that spread across my face. I did it, I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. I finished. Martin's face lit up, his smile broad and genuine. He crossed the room in a few quick steps, pulling me into his arms. I knew you would, he murmured against my hair. I'm so proud of you, Nina. For a moment, I let myself lean into him, the weight of the years falling off my shoulders. He had been there for me through everything, when I felt overwhelmed, when I doubted myself. He had believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. We pulled apart, and Martin cupped my face in his hands, his eyes warm with affection. This is just the beginning, Nina. You're going to do incredible things. Tears welled up in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. For once, they were tears of joy. Of hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind. I received job offers from local businesses, and with the support of the Simons family, I was able to find a position that would allow me to finally provide a stable life for Lander. We moved into a better apartment, still close to his school, but with more space and comfort. For the first time, I felt like I was creating the kind of home Lander deserved. But as things began to settle, I knew there was one final hurdle I had to face. Luis. He hadn't taken kindly to the news of my success. His pride had been bruised ever since Shiela left him, and now he seemed intent on tearing me down any chance he got. One Saturday afternoon, just as I was leaving the Simons house, I saw Luis waiting by my car. My stomach tightened at the sight of him, but I steeled myself. I had worked too hard to let him drag me back down. He leaned against the car, his arms crossed, wearing that smug expression I had come to know all too well. "So, you've managed to scrape together a new life, huh?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. "I heard you finally got a job. What are you gonna do now, Nina? Buy yourself some cheap little apartment and pretend like you're doing fine?" I met his gaze, refusing to let his words get to me. "I already have," I said calmly. "And I'm not pretending, Luis. I am doing fine." His eyes narrowed, clearly not expecting me to stand my ground. "You really think you're something now, don't you? Just because you got a diploma and a job cleaning up other people's messes?" I felt a flicker of anger, but I swallowed it down. He wasn't worth it. Not anymore. "I'm proud of what I've accomplished," I replied, my voice steady. "And I don't care what you think of it. I don't need your approval, Luis. I never did." That hit a nerve. His face twisted with irritation, and he pushed off from the car, stepping closer. "You think Martin is going to stick around when he realizes what a burden you are? He's just playing the nice guy right now, Nina. Eventually, he'll get bored and leave you too. You'll end up right back where you started." I felt the sting of his words, but they didn't sink as deep as they used to. Because I knew they weren't true. Martin wasn't Luis. He had shown me time and again that he was different. He cared for me, and for Lander, in a way that Luis never could. "Martin isn't like you," I said, my voice firm. "And even if he were, I'd be fine on my own. I've already proven that to myself." Luis scoffed, shaking his head. "You're still that same pathetic girl, Nina, no matter how much you try to change." But I wasn't, not anymore. I stood tall, meeting his gaze with unwavering confidence. "No, Luis, you're wrong. I've changed, and I'm not scared of you or your words anymore." At that moment, something shifted in Luis's expression. He looked at me. Really looked at me, for the first time in a long time. He must have realized that his words no longer had the power they once did, that the woman standing in front of him was no longer the one he had manipulated and belittled. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. "You don't get to control me anymore," I added, my voice soft but firm. "And Lander? He sees right through you. No amount of gifts or attention can make up for the way you treated him, and me." Luis opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He just stood there, the weight of his own failure heavy on his shoulders. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the parking lot. Later that night, I sat with Martin on the couch in our modest but comfortable apartment, Lander playing with his toys on the floor. The air was filled with laughter, the kind of lightness I had fought so hard to create in our lives. Martin put his arm around me, pulling me close, and I leaned into him, grateful for everything we had built together. "You know," Martin said, his voice low, "I'm really proud of how you handled Luis today. You didn't let him get to you." I smiled, resting my head on his shoulder. "He doesn't have any power over me anymore, not like he used to." Martin kissed the top of my head. "You're amazing, Nina. And Luis, he knows it too. That's why he keeps trying to tear you down, but he can't. Not anymore." I glanced at Lander, who looked up and flashed me a grin, his face full of love and trust. In that moment, I realized just how far I'd come. I wasn't the broken woman Luis had left behind. I was stronger, smarter, and most importantly, I was free. I had built a new life for myself and my son, a life full of love, support, and hope. And no one, not Luis or anyone else, could take that away from me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly standing tall. Epilogue. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, the sun streaming through the curtains of our cozy apartment, casting a warm glow over everything. I looked around, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace and contentment. It had been months since I had completed my studies, and now I was in a place I had once only dreamed of. Surrounded by love, hope, and a future that felt bright and full of possibilities. As I made breakfast in the kitchen, I could hear Lander laughing as he played with Martin in the living room. They were building a fort out of couch cushions, their voices mingling with the sounds of joy. I smiled to myself, grateful for how far we had come. Just then, Martin peeked his head into the kitchen, a playful grin on his face. "Hey, chef, need any help in there?" I turned to him, my heart fluttering at the sight of his disheveled hair and the light in his eyes. "Only if you promise not to burn the toast like last time," I teased back, chuckling at the memory of our previous breakfast disaster. He feigned offense, placing a hand on his chest. "That was a one-time thing. I swear I was just testing your smoke alarm." I laughed, shaking my head. "Right, that's what they all say." We shared a moment of warmth, the laughter bridging the gap that had once felt so vast between us. It wasn't just that Martin had supported me through thick and thin, it was that he had accepted Lander wholeheartedly, treating him like his own son. The bond they were forming was beautiful to witness. "Can I help?" Lander's small voice chimed in as he entered the kitchen, eyes wide with enthusiasm. He looked up at Martin with admiration. "Of course, buddy," Martin responded, kneeling to Lander's level. "Why don't you help me whisk the eggs?" Lander beamed, rushing to grab a whisk from the drawer. I stepped back, watching them with a full heart, the kind of love swelling inside me that I had yearned for all those years. "Okay, but be careful with the eggs," I said, handing them a bowl. "We don't want a repeat of the pancake incident." "Mom, I thought we agreed to never speak of that again," Martin shot back playfully, causing Lander to giggle. As they worked together, I felt a warmth spreading through me. It was a new beginning, a new family that I had never thought possible, one filled with laughter, support, and unconditional love. But it wasn't just about the joy I found in my relationship with Martin. It was about the triumph of overcoming everything that had once held me down. As the day unfolded, Martin and I took Lander to the park. The air was fresh and the sun warmed our skin. Watching Lander run ahead, his laughter ringing through the air, I exchanged a glance with Martin. We both knew that this moment was special, a testament to how far we had come. "Can you believe how happy he is?" Martin asked, his voice soft, yet full of wonder. I nodded, my heart swelling. "It's everything I hoped for, and more." "I can't believe I almost let fear hold me back from this." Martin reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve all of this, Nina. You've worked so hard to rebuild your life. You're an amazing mom, and seeing you happy makes me happy." "Thank you for being here for us," I replied, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over me. "You've changed everything for me. I don't think I'd be this strong without your support." "Strong? You were always strong. You just needed to see it for yourself," he said, his eyes earnest. "You fought through everything life threw at you, and you came out on the other side." Later that evening, after Lander had gone to bed, Martin and I sat on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the room. It was one of those quiet moments that felt monumental, the kind where you could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. "I've been thinking," Martin started, turning to me, his expression serious yet tender. I looked at him, curiosity piqued. "About what?" He took a deep breath, his hands intertwining nervously. "About us, about our future." My heart raced. I had never been in a place where love felt so right, so genuine. "What do you mean?" I asked gently, wanting to hear every word. "I care about you, Nina, a lot. I've never felt this way about anyone before," he confessed, his eyes searching mine. "I can see a future with you and Lander. I want to be there for both of you, not just now, but always." Emotions swelled in my chest, and I struggled to find my voice. "I want that too, Martin. You and Lander mean everything to me. I can't imagine going through this life without you." He leaned closer, his gaze steady and sincere. "Then, let's do this together. I want to build something real, a family, a life filled with laughter and love. I'm ready if you are." A smile broke across my face, and before I knew it, tears streamed down my cheeks. Yes, I want that too. You have no idea how much I've longed for a family like this." In that moment, Martin reached out and wiped away my tears, his thumb brushing gently against my cheek. Then let's make it happen. While my life was flourishing, I knew that not everyone had found their way. Luis was still struggling, the reality of his choices weighing heavily on him. After losing Shiela again, he found himself alone and desperate, his attempts to win back Lander falling flat. "Why do you keep pushing me away, Lander?" he had pleaded one day when he dropped by the apartment unannounced, frustration etched on his face. "I'm your father. I'm trying to be here for you." Lander, now wise beyond his years, looked up at him, unfazed. "You weren't here when Mom needed you, Dad? And you think gifts will fix everything?" Luis's face fell, the truth of Lander's words striking him hard. "I know I made mistakes, but I'm trying to change. Can't you give me a chance?" But Lander simply shook his head. "You can't just decide to be a dad when it's convenient for you." It was painful to watch, but I could see the realization dawning on Luis that he had lost his chance at redemption. Not just with me, but with Lander as well. The facade of being the loving father crumbled before him, leaving nothing but regret. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the fabric of our new life wove itself into a tapestry of love, laughter, and newfound happiness. I found myself thriving in my career while Martin continued to support Lander's growth, nurturing his interests and dreams. We often sat together, making plans for the future, the kind of future I had once thought was lost to me. One evening, as we settled in to watch a movie, I looked at Martin, his face lit by the flickering screen. The comfort of our routine wrapped around us like a warm blanket, and I realized just how lucky I was. "Thank you for being you," I said, my heart full. "I've never felt more at home than I do with you." He turned to me, his expression softening. "And I'll always be here, Nina. You're not just a part of my life. You're my life." I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his, knowing that together we could face anything. As the movie played on, I let myself drift into thoughts of our future, filled with dreams and possibilities. In the wreckage of my past, I had reclaimed my life on my own terms. I was no longer defined by the pain I had endured, but empowered by the strength I had discovered within myself. I had found love, and more importantly, I had found happiness. True happiness. With Martin by my side and Lander's laughter filling our home, I felt like I had finally stepped into the light, ready to embrace all that life had to offer. The end. If you're enjoying the love stories here on True Hearts Novel, don't forget to subscribe. By subscribing, you'll never miss an update, and you'll be the first to know when we drop new romantic tales that will sweep you off your feet. Hit that notification bell too, so you'll get alerted whenever we post fresh content. Let's keep this journey of love going together. Subscribe now, and stay tuned for more heartfelt stories.